Starting with the great name of Allah, who is the most merciful and benevolent. Today we will study lesson number 12, which is Hitch-Hiking Across the Sahara, written by G.F. Lamb. Let's read the text first, then I will explain it. If a giant were to pick England up and put it down in the middle of the Sahara Desert, we should have quite a task to find it. The full Sahara area, stretching almost the complete width of North Africa, is many times the size of Great Britain. About half of this gigantic area is mainly under French control. Very recently, indeed, the discovery of oil beneath the sand has begun to bring changes. But less than 3 years ago, most of the area had for countless years consisted of immense stretches of barren sand, intensely hot during the day, with few water wells and little vegetation. Large parts were almost uninhabited. In other parts, there were just a few towns very widely scattered and occasional wandering tribes of Arabs and Berbers. Hardly the land one would think in which to go hitchhiking, yet this was just the mode of travel that Robert Christopher, a young American, decided to adopt in the Sahara crossing, which he began in 1956. When he was a child, every time he was naughty, his foster mother used to threaten to send him to Timbuktu, an ancient city in the heart of French Africa. Instead of alarming him, the idea aroused in him a keen desire to see this distant place. By the time he was a young man, he was firmly gripped by the wanderlust. His first adventure was to go around the world at the cost of $80. After this, he determined that his next journey should be to travel right across the Sahara from Algiers on the north coast of Africa to Timbuktu, which is near the river Niger in the extreme south of the Great Desert. The Trans-Sahara journey began at a little town, Busada, known to the natives at the port as the port of the Sahara, for it is here that the desert really starts. Christopher discovered that a desert truck was leaving for the south shortly, and he arranged with the driver to be given a lift as far as it went. The conditions were agonizing. 3 men, driver, grazer, and passengers, sat side by side in the front seat, traveling at a bare 32 kilometers an hour, while the temperature rose steadily. In 2 hours, a flask of cold water became hot enough to make tea. Presently, a fast-moving weapons carrier overtook them. Christopher stopped and begged the lieutenant in charge to relieve him from the misery of slowly baking to death at 20 miles an hour. The lieutenant pointed out that strict military regulation forbade the carrying of civilians. Christopher replied by producing a permit from the War Ministry, giving him permission to join the French Foreign Legion for a short period in order to collect materials for an article. The permission had later been withdrawn, but fortunately the lieutenant did not turn the paper over and see the cancel stamp. He was dropped at the town of Gardaya, a typical desert city, except that there the flies are even more numerous and stickier than they are anywhere else. Anything that has the remotest relationship with food, Christopher states, is constantly and completely covered with the flies. They have no hesitation in following the food right into your mouth, and I had to be vigilant until each mouthful was safely behind my teeth. I saw many children on the streets, but I got only a vague idea of what they looked like, for they all wore a mask of flies. He was able to continue his hitchhike to the south in the leisurely manner that was so typical of the desert. On the day of his arrival, he discovered that there was a truck due to leave at once for Algoli. This truck was a new and powerful one and carried all kinds of goods: pins, needles, sewing machines, pots, pans, machine parts. It weighed 10 tons. For about 10 miles outside the town, the road continued. Then it stopped. The route lay across an apparently trackless desert. Nonetheless, the driver picked his way with uncanny skill. It was difficult traveling. At times, the sand became too soft to bear the weight of the heavy truck. It was then necessary to stop at once. If the wheels had been allowed to spin, they would have dug themselves deeper. 10-foot strips of steel mesh were dragged from the truck and placed together to make a runway for the wheels to bite on as the truck moved. When it reached harder ground, the strips were collected up and dragged forward to the waiting truck. Christopher performed useful service in helping the grazer with this arduous operation. The driver added to the discomfort of the journey by relating details of a recent case in which 3 English people had attempted to cross a part of the desert in a car with only 1 day's water supply. Their car had become stuck in a sand dune, and 3 days later their bodies were found dried up like leaves. They had drained the radiator in their desperate thirst, and one of them tried to drain the oil from the crankcase. Hantout had been one of the search party, and he spared his listener none of the grim details. The story came vividly to Christopher's mind on the second morning. The grazer announced that one of the two goatskin bags of water had burst during the night. Even if everything went well, the rest of the journey would not be pleasant. An outpost with a water supply was found on one of Christopher's maps, and they set off towards it. By dawn, they had gone 50 miles and dug out of 5 more sand dunes. Christopher was sick with thirst, and to add to his misery, he had jumped barefooted from the driver's cabin on one occasion, not realizing the intense heat of the sand. It was if he had jumped into a bed of hot coals. With a scream of pain, he hopped back into the truck. Meanwhile, his thirst grew fiercer. Everything was dead and dry and hot. My mind was foggy. I was on fire. The inside of my head felt dried up, and my lungs hurt from the hot air. There were times when I tried to make myself faint, but my head was pounding with such pain that it kept me conscious. The outpost was discovered at last, and it contained a well full of cool water. They drank until they could drink no more. They certainly needed it. The heat was incredible. In the shade of the mud house, the temperature reached 130 Fahrenheit, while out on the sand, the thermometer registered 165 Fahrenheit, which is nearly 30 degrees higher than the highest temperature officially recorded. Algolia, 100 miles on, was reached without further mishap. It was a fascinating little town, a true oasis with so much water available that they hardly knew what to do with it. Every day of the week that he was there, Christopher spent hours bathing in a little pool half a kilometer from the center of the town, shaded by palm trees and fruit trees, or lying on the cool grass beside the pool, watching the birds off feasting on the dates. What a contrast from the desert all around it. The journey from Algolian to Insula was not without its excitement. It was made in a heavy truck carrying 10 tons of ammunition, driven by a particularly able and experienced driver who made his way across the apparently trackless desert. Was a source of constant amazement to Christopher. During the next day, Christopher suffered one of his worst experiences. Baham assured him that it would be a good thing to mix a little wine with the water. Christopher was doubtful, but he risked it. The result was disastrous. During the heat of the day, they were lying in the shade of the truck, and the two Arabians asleep, wanting something from the driver's cabin. He got up to get it. As he was climbing up, he was suddenly overcome by a strange sickness. His head started to pound, and he found himself shivering violently. He knew he was going to collapse, so he made a desperate effort to avoid the blazing sand. His fall, as he blacked out, fortunately woke the other two, and they dragged him completely into the shade. For an hour he could not speak. His two companions took off their turbans and poured water on them, using them to rub his body gently in order to keep his temperature down. When he recovered his senses, they gave him as much water as he could drink. The quality of the water is not the only respect in which Insula differs from the Algolia. The little town, with its shady swimming pools and its luxuriant trees and plants, has triumphed over the barrenness of the desert. Insula is fighting a desperate battle for survival, and perhaps losing the contest. The sand is constantly encroaching on the town. Parts of the town are being swallowed by the desert. It is a frightening thing to see. Man has tried by every means to hold it back, but in spite of his effort, the desert keeps tightening its stranglehold. Palm trees that once lifted their branches high above the dunes are now like bushes, and some of them are completely covered. I bent down and picked dates off some of them. Many people have had to leave their homes. Storm fences do little if any good. A truck was leaving shortly, a big, dirty, clumsy looking oil truck. This time the driver and grazers seemed reluctant to take him. Although they finally agreed, they did their best to go without him. It turned out that they believed him to be a Frenchman, and they disliked the French. When they found that he was an American, they became friendly at once. It was unbearably stifling in the driver's cabin. Christopher was completely overcome overcome at one point, and when a midday stop was made at a little mud building outpost, he staggered inside to the astonishment of the French officer quartered there and lay down on the floor to be ill. Fortunately, he had recovered by the evening and was able to continue the truck journey. Tamanrasset was reached at last, and here Christopher made one of his most valuable contacts. This was Professor Claude Belengornen, a remarkable Frenchman who had devoted himself to help the Tauric people. He succeeded in convincing them that education would be useful to them. Then, most wisely, he adapted himself to their habits and customs so that he could help them to get the most from their own natural way of life, rather than persuade them to adopt Western habits unsuited to their land and tradition. Belengornen acted as Christopher's guide, host, and friend while he was in Tamanrasset. With his assistance, Christopher was able to spend a week in the encampment of the Tauric king, an experience which he found fascinating. The Taurics, though their life is primitive, are a people of great dignity, extreme honesty, high intelligence, and with quite an ancient history. In preparation for this visit, Christopher learned to ride a camel, a task which he found more difficult than it looks. During his first lesson, he was thrown over the animal's head 3 times and once over its rear. It was on this formidable type of transport that he was to continue his Sahara journey. There were no more trucks. Belengornen arranged for one of his most educated pupils, a young Tauric noble named Boubacar, to act as guide for the first few days of the 1,280 kilometers journey from Tamanrasset to Timbuktu. The start was made at dawn. Boubacar and Christopher, each on a camel, with a third carrying Christopher's supplies. It would probably be 2 or 3 weeks before the next village was reached, so it was essential for him to take enough food and drink to last that time. Out in the burning desert, there are no villages to turn to if food runs short. The most difficult and dangerous stage of the journey now had to be endured. It began when Christopher was handed over by the leader of a big caravan to a small group who were willing to go to Kidal, about 160 kilometers from Timbuktu. The little party, 2 Taurics, a slave, and Christopher began by setting out to find a well which was on their route in order to replenish their water bags. They reached it at last, and it was bone dry. There was only 1 tin of food left in Christopher's pack, and the 4 of them shared the beans it contained. His guides carried no food at all and very little water. By the time darkness came, Christopher's water supply was down to 1 liter. At this point, 20 large vultures were discovered, and these stood watching the travelers with interest, making up their minds whether they wanted white or dark meat for the meal they were sure they would soon be eating. The vultures were to be disappointed. The 4 men went to sleep early, a desert custom when travelers are hungry or thirsty, and next morning were still alive. They had just enough water left to make 1 cup of tea each and then set off for the next water hole, about 5 hours distance. When they reached it just before the hottest part of the day, they found that this too, like the previous hole, was completely dry. The next water hole was 2 days away, and the travelers now had neither food nor water. The further looked grim. There was just 1 chance of survival. 1 of 6 camels could be killed. The decision was made. Christopher began being asked to pay his share of the cost, to which he willingly agreed. Strangely enough, as soon as a camel was picked for the slaughter, it seemed to know what was to happen and started screaming at the top of its voice. When the victim was killed, the liquid in its stomach was caught in a water bag by the slave. It would be hard to think of a less appetizing drink than the greenish fluid like this thin blood produced from this source. Even the Tauric made faces as they drank it. Christopher could not tackle it, parched though he was, until he had boiled it, and even then he had to hold his nose while he drank it. Somehow he got it down. Together with the camel's flesh, the unappetizing liquid kept them going for another 2 days. The region through which they were passing was known as the land of thirst and death, and the names was well chosen. It was an area notorious for sandstorms as well as for dried up water holes. Christopher soon experienced one of them shortly after the midday stop on the following day. The camels all instinctively turned off their courses to the right, making for the nearest depression in the waste of sand. The reason presently became clear to Christopher as he gazed at the horizon. It was incredible. The dunes seemed to be on fire, the peaks were melting away, and the whole horizon was changing shape. Then, as it started to get dark, I heard a sound like wind blowing through the leaves of a tree. His companions made signs for him to hide himself behind his camel and cover his head. He did so, but the force of the storm when it struck was too great to be avoided. Even with the camel's body as a shield, I could feel the impact of wall of sand that came streaming along the earth. The wind found even the smallest opening in my clothes, and the sand felt like little needles. There was nothing he could do but crouch down, waiting for the storm to finish, while the sand steadily piled up on the top of him. He found himself recalling a true story that just a sandstorm many years earlier had completely buried a huge caravan of 1,200 camels without leaving a trace of them. The present storm, fortunately, was less drastic and lasted only half an hour, but they all had 75 millimeters of sand completely covering them, and it did not need much imagination to understand how a party could easily be buried and suffocated. Kidal was the last town on his route before Timbuktu itself, but there were still over 450 kilometers of grim desert to be crossed. This proved to be the loneliest and most arduous stage of the whole desert crossing. The stress of desert travel had affected him physically. His hand had become so cracked that he could hardly use his camera. To add to his troubles, he took his camel one day across a huge slab of rock on a slight incline. Then he realized that it was covered with tiny stones. His camel fell heavily, knocking him off its back, and though it was not really injured, it was so shocked and frightened that he could not ride it for some time, but had to follow it on foot. Another little incident served as a reminder that the desert has many ways of destroying its victims. Christopher was helping to gather stones to place in the fire for the kettle or pan to stand on. He picked up one large rock to find a 4-foot snake coiled under it. It uncoiled rapidly and struck, but he managed to jump back just in time to avoid the deadly fang. The guide slave killed it with a stone, indicating by gestures that it was a very poisonous specimen. A day later, he caught his first glimpse of Timbuktu. He had reached his goal at last, and his journey had taken him across 32 kilometers of desert. This was the end of his this main journey, but it was by no means the end of his adventures. The stay in Timbuktu had enabled him to recover some of the weight he had lost in the desert, and he was beginning to feel fit and well. He experienced a curious longing to see some more of strange and mighty desert before leaving the country, perhaps for good. A sudden decision was made. He sent a telegram to Professor Claude Bellingjordan in Tamanrasset and then flew rapidly eastward by plane, partially across the land of thirst and death, across which he had so painfully toiled. From Agadez, he travelled north to meet Bellingjordan, partly in a hired jeep with a French lieutenant, partly by camel. The arrangement was that the professor would drive south in his jeep from Tamanrasset to a well at in Aben Garret, where Christopher would wait for him. If Christopher had not after all reached it by the appointed day, then Bellingjordan would continue south on the primitive road towards Agadez. Unfortunately, the caravan with which Christopher was travelling insisted on making a lengthy detour to water their camels at a well some distance from the road. The American insisted on getting back to the road again as soon as possible, expressing himself vigorously to the leader by signs, as they could not speak each other's language. But by the time they got back to the road, 2 days had been lost. The caravan presently left the route, but a boy acted as a guide to lead Christopher to the well at in Aben Garret. It was reached just at nightfall, and the following morning the boy went back, leaving Christopher alone to await the arrival, as he supposed, of the professor from the north. There is no village at in Aben Garret. The only building is a burj, which is a simple mud structure consisting of a roof and 4 walls, with one hole to serve as a window and another to serve as a door. The well is about 275 meters away. When he reached it, He had a shock. There was water there, all right, but it was a good 46 meters below, and there was neither rope nor bucket. He returned to the board and stretched his back. The only possible container to bring up the water was a small metal teapot, which would carry about half a cupful of liquid at a time if a line was tied to the handle and the spout plugged up. A line tied to the handle, but where was the line? Fastening together all the available bits of cord and articles of clothing, he could at first make only 8 meters. On an inspiration, he tore the turban he was wearing into 4 strips till the teapot reached no more than halfway down the well. What else? His sleeping bag. No, for it was now the winter season, which meant that the nights were bitterly cold, although the days, by normal standards, were still unbearably hot. Without a sleeping bag or blanket, he would freeze to death. The night he lay in his sleeping bag, picturing himself dying of thirst and hunger if the professor did not arrive in the next day or two. He had with him a small recording machine. The notion of death suggested to him that it might be a good idea to record his last thoughts for the benefit of those who found his body. The set was battery operated, with thin wire as the recording medium. It dawned on him suddenly that here was the rope he needed to reach the water in the well. The wire was very thin, little thicker than a human hair, but it was about 305 or 305 meters long. By putting several strands together, it should be possible to make a line strong enough to bear the weight of a small teapot half full of water. The scheme worked. 7 strands of wire, laboriously twisted together, just reached comfortably to water level in the well. The liquid brought up in the teapot was not particularly inviting. It was like a mixture of mud and sulfur, but it was drinkable, and it would save him from dying of death or thirst. He spent the whole morning drawing up potful after potful, and was able to collect 523 liters to take back to the boat. The following evening, as he sat outside the boat, staring only half consciously at the horizon, he noticed a small sandstorm blowing vaguely in his direction. Could it be the dust raised by a car? No, there was too much of it for that. There was indeed too much dust to be raised by a small jeep, but it was a rescue party nonetheless. 2 big desert patrol cars came roaring up to the bridge, and Death reluctantly departed. Claude Bellingonin and a friend arrived a few hours later in the jeep. What had happened was that they had missed meeting Christopher during the unfortunate 2-day detour. They had later been misdirected by a native who thought Christopher had returned to Agades. When they reached Agades and discovered the native's error, Bellingonin realized that Christopher must have missed them on the road, and that he was probably waiting in Abenguerret, short of food. He very sensibly got in touch with the desert patrol, and they sent out 4 trucks to cover the desert north from Agades, and in particular to visit in Abenguerret. His foresight saved Christopher's life and enabled the hitchhiking journey across the Sahara to end in a return to Hoggar region instead of in a sandy grave in the heart of desert. Okay, this lesson is about a small boy named Christopher. When he was a small child, his mother used to when he was a small child, he used to be very naughty. His foster mother used to threaten him to send him to Timbuktu to silence him. It is a distant place in the Great Desert, but instead of becoming afraid, he desired to see that place one day. That place is situated in Sahara Desert. The size of the Sahara is very large. It is very vast and extensive. It is bigger than England, which is a large country. And it is said that if we place England in the middle of the Sahara, it would be very difficult to find it. Okay, the most noticeable feature of the desert city named Gardaya was its numerous and stickier flies. All the food items seemed to be covered with flies. The flies did not hesitate to follow food into the mouth of the eaters. Even children were not easily recognizable. And there was another city or another little town named Algolia. It is also called Paradise of the Desert. This town is very charming and attractive. It has many plants and fruit trees. There is greenery all around it. Water is readily available, while Insula is called Hell of the Desert. It is largely based on sand. The area is mainly infertile. Water is very rare. Desert is destroying plantations here. Okay, then Christopher, on his way, meets a professor whose name is Claude Bellinghorn. He was a Frenchman. He was really a great and kind man. He had devoted his life to the service and welfare of the Tauric people. He educated them. He also taught them good manners. He wanted to improve their lives. He wanted to improve. He also wanted to make them a civilized and respectable nation. He was a very cooperative and caring fellow. Then Christopher stays in Aben Garrett, and his stay in Aben Garrett was very painful and fearful. He was friendless and helpless. He was short of water. His condition was very bad, and he needed water to keep himself alive. He was thinking of death. At last, he found a well, but the water was very low. He hit upon a plan. He took a teapot and made a line from the wire of a recording device. He satisfied his thirst and came to life. After some time, Professor Claude Bellinghorn came to rescue him. That's all.